Stop right there. I know exactly what you are picturing when I mention a medieval castle. You are thinking of majestic stone towers, valiant knights in shining armor, and grand feasts with endless wine. You are basically imagining a high-budget Disney movie. Well, I am here to personally ruin that fantasy for you. The reality of living in a castle was not magical. It was a nightmare of hygiene, bizarre social rules, and smells that would make a modern sewer rat pass out. These places were dark, damp, freezing cold, and filled with people who thought forks were a tool of the devil. We are about to walk through 33 absolutely dumbest, weirdest, and grossest facts about castle life that history teachers usually skip to keep you from throwing up. Welcome to the real Middle Ages. 1. You might picture a castle floor covered in fresh golden straw as rustic and charming, but in reality, it was a biological weapon affectionately known as the floor lasagna. The rushes on the floor were almost never changed completely. Instead, when the top layer got nasty, servants would just sprinkle fresh straw over the filth to hide it, building up a disgusting geological timeline of decomposition. We are talking about 20 years of unmitigated grossness packed down into a solid surface containing vomit, dog poop, spilled beer, fish scraps, and the saliva of 100 guests. It got so bad that the smell was often described as a physical wall that hit you when you walked in, and they had to scatter strong-smelling herbs just to keep people from fainting during dinner. When they finally did clean it out, they probably needed a hazmat suit to handle the layers of ancient, fermented sludge living right under their feet. 2. Modern people freak out if a single dog hair gets on their sweater. But in a medieval castle, the dogs were basically the residential cleaning crew and the primary waste management system. Since napkins were a luxury and throwing food away was a hassle, the standard dining etiquette was to simply sweep your bones, gristle, and grease right onto the floor for the pack of hunting hounds to devour. These dogs were running wild under the tables during serious diplomatic dinners, fighting over pork chops and likely nipping at the ankles of dukes and earls while they tried to discuss politics. It was considered totally normal to have a wet, muddy dog licking the grease off your hand between bites because, in their minds, that was just an efficient way to wash up without wasting precious water, turning every banquet into a chaotic petting zoo. 3. If you sat down at a royal banquet today, you would expect silverware, but back then, using a fork was considered an insult to the Almighty himself and a fast track to hell. The church actually preached that God gave humans perfectly good fingers to touch the bounty of the earth, so using a metal prong to spear your meat was seen as artificial, weirdly effeminate, and even demonic. This meant that everyone, from the lowest servant to the King of England, was grabbing chunks of saucy meat with their bare hands, creating an absolute mess. Imagine a room full of the most powerful people in Europe with grease dripping down their chins and into their velvet sleeves, wiping their filthy hands on their coats or a piece of stale bread because using a fork was just too controversial for their delicate religious sensibilities. 4. Social manners were incredibly specific about bodily fluids, especially when it came to the art of spitting, which was practically a national sport. It was considered physically unhealthy to hold in your saliva due to the medical theory of humors, so spitting during a meal was perfectly acceptable, provided you followed the dumbest rule in the book. You were allowed to hawk a loogie onto the floor, but etiquette demanded that you immediately step on it and grind it into the straw with your foot to hide the evidence. The logic was not about hygiene but safety, as they were genuinely worried someone might slip on your spit and break their neck. So the height of sophistication involved rubbing your own fluids into the dirt floor while maintaining polite conversation about the local harvest, essentially doing a gross little dance while you ate. 5. The kitchen was home to something called the perpetual stew, which sounds like a magic spell but was actually a culinary horror show that could rival any modern health code violation. A massive cauldron would sit over the fire, and it was rarely, if ever, fully emptied or cleaned out, sometimes simmering for years at a time. Every single day, the cooks would just throw new ingredients into the pot. A rabbit here, some cabbage there, maybe a pigeon, to top it up. This means that while you were eating a carrot from Tuesday, you might also be scooping up the disintegrated remains of a piece of pork from 3 weeks ago. As long as the brown sludge kept boiling, they figured it was safe to eat, creating a chaotic flavor profile where you were essentially eating the ghosts of dinners past in every spoonful. 6. We still use the phrase upper crust today to talk about rich people, but the origin of the term is literally baked into the dirty, gritty reality of castle ovens. Because baking technology was primitive, the bottom of a loaf of bread rested directly on the hot wood, ash, and stone of the oven, making it burnt, hard, and covered in charcoal grit. Obviously, the lord of the castle was not going to shatter his teeth on charcoal bread like a peasant. So, the kitchen staff would slice the loaf horizontally, giving the nasty, burnt bottom half to the servants to gnaw on, while the perfectly baked, golden, crispy top half was sliced off and served exclusively to the nobility. Your social standing was physically defined by which part of the sandwich you were legally allowed to chew, making inequality something you could literally taste. 7. You might see a swan gliding gracefully across a lake and think it looks beautiful. But in medieval times, looking at that bird the wrong way could get you executed for treason. Swans were considered the ultimate status symbol and were effectively the property of the crown or high nobility, making them strictly off-limits to the common man. If a starving peasant was caught killing and eating a swan, it was treated with the same severity as betraying the king. The rich would roast them whole, often skinning them carefully and then putting the feathers back on the cooked meat to make it look alive on the platter, sometimes even gilding the beak with gold. It was the ultimate flex, proving you were powerful enough to eat a creature that anyone else would die for just thinking about, prioritizing visual drama over actual taste. 8. Dinner parties were a minefield of social anxiety centered entirely around a giant container of salt, which acted as the GPS for your social status. Salt was incredibly expensive and a massive luxury, so the massive, ornate salt cellar was placed in the middle of the high table to draw a clear line. Where you sat in relation to that salt determined your worth as a human being in the eyes of the host. If you were important, you sat above the salt, near the head of the table in the good food. If you were a minor guest or a distant relative nobody liked, you sat below the salt at the far end of the table. It was a brutal, physical divider that let everyone in the room know exactly how much money and respect you had without anyone saying a single word, turning dinner into a public ranking system. 9. You probably imagine a castle bathroom as a private, dignified chamber, but it was actually a terrifying hole in the floor known as the garderobe. This was essentially a stone bench with a hole that opened directly into the empty air outside the castle wall. Gravity was the only flushing mechanism available, meaning the waste simply plummeted down the side of the magnificent stone structure, leaving long, brown, frozen streaks that everyone could see from miles away. The name garderobe actually means wardrobe, because people would hang their expensive clothes in the toilet shaft. They believed the ammonia fumes rising from the pit below would kill fleas and moths, so your fancy outfit for the banquet literally smelled like a public restroom, which was somehow considered a hygiene hack. 10. Hollywood loves to show the lord and lady relaxing in a steaming private bath, but the reality was a logistical nightmare that resulted in the shared bath myth. Heating water required carrying hundreds of buckets from a well and heating them over a fire, which took hours of backbreaking labor. Because of this effort, the entire family used the exact same bathwater. The father went first when the water was clean and hot, followed by the other men, then the women, and finally the children. By the time the youngest baby was dipped in, the water was a thick gray sludge of dead skin, dirt, and urine. This is literally where the phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater" comes from, because the water was so opaque you could actually lose an infant in the filth. 11. If you panic when you run out of toilet paper today, you would not survive 5 minutes in the Middle Ages because their wiping methods were absolute torture. The rich might have used small pieces of cloth, but for everyone else the options were aggressive and painful natural resources. We are talking about grabbing a handful of moss, damp hay, or even a smooth river stone to scrape your most delicate areas clean. But the absolute worst option was the communal sponge on a stick, which was soaked in a bucket of vinegar and reused by multiple people in the latrine. You would essentially be sharing a wiping tool with every other person in the castle, passing around bacteria like a disgusting relay race baton while hoping the vinegar killed the worst of it. 12. Laundry day in a castle was not about the fresh scent of mountain springs. It was powered by the strong, stinging chemical punch of stale human urine. People quickly realized that old pee turns into ammonia, which is a fantastic bleaching agent for getting stains out of wool and linen. Therefore, chamber pots were not just emptied. The contents were carefully collected and saved in large vats. The laundry women would then throw the clothes into these tubs of urine and stomp on them with their bare feet, exactly like people crushing grapes for wine, but infinitely grosser. So while the knights looked sparkling white in their tunics, their clothes had been thoroughly marinated in the bodily fluids of the entire household to achieve that crisp, clean look. 13. All that waste dropping down the castle walls had to go somewhere, creating a job opening for the absolute worst profession in history, the Gong farmer. These brave souls were tasked with digging out the cesspits at the bottom of the castle or cleaning the latrines. Because the work was so foul, they were only allowed to work at night so the nobility wouldn't have to look at them. They would descend into the pits, often waist-deep in months of accumulated human excrement, shoveling it into buckets to cart away. The fumes were so toxic they could actually kill you, but strangely enough, it was one of the highest-paid jobs of the era. You were essentially a millionaire who smelled like death, living a life where swimming in poop was just another Tuesday at the office. 14. Movies always depict the castle moat as a beautiful, shimmering blue ring of water that reflects the towers, but in reality, it was basically an open-air septic tank. Since many of the castle toilets emptied directly into the moat, and people threw all their trash, dead animals, and kitchen slop into it, the water was a stagnant, bubbling swamp of disease. It was designed to stop enemies, and honestly, wading through neck-deep sewage is a pretty effective deterrent for any invading army. In the summer heat, the moat would release bubbles of methane gas that made the entire castle smell like a rotten egg factory. If you fell in, you didn't just get wet. You likely died from a massive infection before you even managed to swim to the shore. 15. If you traveled back in time, the first thing that would hit you isn't the sight of knights, but a smell so overpowering it would make your eyes water. To combat the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage in the streets, and the open sewers we just mentioned, people carried nosegays. These were small, handheld bouquets of fragrant herbs and flowers that they held directly against their noses while walking around. It wasn't just a fashion statement or a romantic gesture. It was a portable gas mask. People also believed in the miasma theory, thinking that bad smells actually carried disease. So sniffing a flower was their version of wearing a surgical mask. They were literally trying to filter the air through petals just to keep their lunch down. 16. When the sun went down, the castle didn't glow with the warm, romantic light of beeswax candles, because those were expensive and reserved for the church. Instead, the castle was lit by tallow candles, which were made from rendered animal fat, usually leftover from cows or sheep. While they did provide light, they burned with a thick black smoke that coated the walls and lungs of everyone inside. Worse than the smoke was the smell. Burning tallow smells exactly like rancid meat cooking in a dirty pan. So, a romantic evening in the Great Hall didn't smell like vanilla or lavender. It smelled like a greasy burger joint that had caught on fire, leaving a stench that clung to your clothes and hair for days afterwards. 17. You might think of a castle as a solid stone fortress, but in the winter, the interior turned into a bizarre agricultural obstacle course to fight the cold. To combat the bone-chilling freeze radiating from the stone floors, servants would pile loose straw so thick that walking through the Great Hall was like trudging through a deep snowdrift. We are talking about shin-deep layers of dry grass that you had to physically wade through to get to the dinner table. This created a chaotic environment where small items like coins, jewelry, or entire uneaten chicken legs would be dropped and lost forever in the grassy abyss. It was basically an indoor hayride that trapped dirt and food, meaning you were essentially living inside a giant decomposing hamster cage just to keep your toes from turning black with frostbite. 18. When you see beautiful, intricate tapestries hanging on castle walls in museums, you probably think they were just expensive decorations for art lovers, but they were actually desperate survival tools. Medieval stone walls were terrible at keeping the weather out, often full of cracks and gaps that let icy winds whistle through the rooms. The draft inside a castle was often strong enough to blow out a candle. Those heavy wool tapestries were hung not for aesthetics but to create a physical barrier between the freezing stone and the living space. They were basically fancy insulation foam. Without them, the majestic Great Hall would feel like a wind tunnel, and you would be shivering uncontrollably while trying to look regal in your velvet robes, proving that medieval interior design was fueled entirely by the fear of freezing to death. 19. We all have that romantic image of sitting by a roaring castle fireplace, but the thermodynamics of medieval heating were an absolute nightmare. The fireplaces were massive, sure, but they were incredibly inefficient at actually heating the room because most of the heat went straight up the chimney. If you sat close enough to feel the warmth, you experienced a phenomenon known as the roasted face, frozen back syndrome. The radiation from the fire would be practically melting your eyebrows off and sweating through your tunic, while the drafty air behind you was simultaneously turning your spine into an icicle. You had to constantly rotate like a human rotisserie chicken just to maintain a body temperature that didn't result in hypothermia or heat stroke within the same 10 minutes. 20. Windows in a medieval castle were not the clear portals to the outside world that we have today. For most of history, they were literally just holes in the wall called wind eyes. Glass was astronomically expensive and rare, so unless you were a king, you didn't have it. Instead, you had wooden shutters or maybe a piece of cloth soaked in animal grease to let a tiny bit of light through. This presented a terrible daily dilemma. You could either close the wooden shutters to stay warm but live in total, pitch-black darkness, or you could open them to see the sun but immediately let in the freezing rain, snow, and wind. You basically had to choose between living in a cave or living in a refrigerator, with no happy medium in between. 21. If you are the type of person who needs a walk-in closet for your wardrobe, medieval life would break you instantly because closets simply did not exist. They didn't build storage spaces into the stone walls, so all your clothes, linens, and valuables were stuffed into heavy wooden chests that sat at the foot of the bed. This meant your expensive velvet tunics were constantly wrinkled, folded, and smelling of whatever wood or herbs were in the box. If you didn't use a chest, you just hung your clothes on wooden pegs driven into the wall, leaving them exposed to the dust, soot from the fire, and dampness of the room. The concept of displaying your clothes on hangers was centuries away, so living out of a trunk was the standard for even the wealthiest dukes. 22. Privacy is a very modern invention, and in a medieval castle, the master bedroom was practically a public train station. The lord and lady almost never slept alone because body heat was a precious resource. Servants often slept in the same room on trundle beds, or simply on the floor at the foot of the master's bed to keep the room warm. In some cases, a favorite servant or a squire would actually sleep in the bed with the noble to act as a human hot water bottle. It was also a security measure. If an assassin came in, they had to trip over the valet first. So your intimate nighttime routine involved undressing and snoring in a pile of other people, completely erasing any chance of personal space. 23. If you looked at a medieval bed, you would notice mountains of pillows propped up against the headboard because nobody slept lying flat. There was a widespread and genuine superstition that lying perfectly horizontal was a posture reserved exclusively for the dead and corpses in coffins. People were terrified that if they lay flat, the blood would rush to their head and cause a stroke, or that devils might mistake them for a dead body and snatch their soul. As a result, everyone slept in a semi-upright seated position, practically dozing off while sitting up in bed. It looked incredibly uncomfortable, essentially like sleeping on a cheap airplane seat every single night of your life just to convince the Grim Reaper that you were still busy using your body. 24. We take for granted that we know exactly what we look like, but in the Middle Ages, seeing your own reflection was a rare and blurry event. High-quality glass mirrors with silver backing hadn't been invented yet. If you wanted to check your hair, you had to look into a piece of polished bronze, steel, or a basin of still water. These reflections were dark, distorted, and fuzzy at best. This means that most people, even the wealthy, went through their entire lives having only a vague idea of their own facial features. You could have a piece of spinach stuck in your teeth for 40 years and never know it, because your mirror was just a shiny metal plate that made you look like a funhouse distortion. 25. If you wandered into a castle room labeled the buttery, you would probably get excited expecting to find mounds of delicious, yellow churned cream for your bread. But you would be totally wrong, and honestly, likely a little drunk. The word actually comes from the French bouteille, or the cask known as a butt, meaning this room was entirely dedicated to storing booze. It was the castle's liquor cabinet on steroids, stacked high with barrels of wine and ale. The man in charge, the butler, wasn't just a guy opening doors, he was the keeper of the alcohol, which made him arguably the most popular guy in the entire fortress. So, despite the tasty name, the buttery was just a glorified warehouse for getting hammered, proving that medieval architects prioritized day drinking over dairy products. 26. Today, a curfew is what your parents gave you to keep you from partying too late. But in the Middle Ages, it was a government-mandated rule to stop you from burning the city down. The word literally comes from the French phrase couvre-feu, which translates to cover fire. At a specific time every night, a bell would ring, signaling everyone to physically cover their open fires with a metal lid or ash to dampen the flames while they slept. Since castles and towns were basically piles of dry wood and straw, leaving a fire burning unattended was a recipe for mass destruction. So, the original curfew wasn't about controlling your social life. It was a desperate safety protocol to ensure you didn't wake up to find your entire neighborhood reduced to a pile of smoking ash. 27. When we think of castle defenses, we picture boiling oil or arrows, but they had a much weirder biological weapon in their arsenal: weaponized bees. During a siege, when the enemy was banging at the gates, defenders would sometimes grab entire beehives from the castle gardens and hurl them over the walls onto the attackers below. Imagine trying to storm a fortress in heavy metal armor, unable to scratch an itch or run away fast, while thousands of angry, stinging insects swarm inside your helmet. It was primitive, chaotic, and terrifyingly effective. It brings a whole new meaning to the idea of a buzzing atmosphere, proving that medieval warfare was less about honor and more about throwing literal angry bugs at people until they ran away crying. 28. The legal system today relies on evidence, lawyers, and juries, but in medieval times they preferred a method called trial by combat. If two people had a dispute, say you accused your neighbor of stealing your cow, the judge wouldn't ask for proof. Instead, he would tell you to grab a sword and fight to the death. The logic was that God would intervene and ensure that the innocent party won the fight. This meant that you could be completely innocent, but if you were bad at fencing or just physically small, you would get stabbed and then posthumously found guilty because you died. It was a legal system where might makes right was the official policy, allowing the biggest bully in the village to win every single lawsuit just by bludgeoning the plaintiff. 29. Being a royal tutor was tough because you couldn't legally hit the prince when he messed up, since the king's son was considered divinely chosen and untouchable. To solve this, they invented the whipping boy. This was a poor kid, often a friend of the prince, who grew up alongside him. Whenever the prince failed a test or misbehaved, the tutor would drag the whipping boy out and beat him while the prince had to watch. The psychological idea was that the prince would feel so guilty about his friend getting hurt that he would study harder next time. It was a messed up system of emotional manipulation where a random kid got physical trauma just because the future king was too lazy to learn his multiplication tables. 30. Castles had dungeons, and then they had the oubliette, a room designed solely for psychological torture. The name comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget, and that was the literal instruction for the guards. It was a tiny bottle-shaped pit, dug deep into the foundation with no doors and no windows, only a trap door in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered down on a rope and simply left there in total darkness, sometimes in a space so narrow they couldn't even sit down. There was no trial, no release date, and no food service. You were thrown into a stone hole specifically so the world could pretend you didn't exist anymore, slowly rotting away in the dark while life continued just a few feet above your head. 31. Medieval maps were filled with invisible red tape, specifically concerning where you could walk with a dead body. They had specific paths called corpse roads that were legally designated for carrying coffins from a village to the cemetery. There was a deep superstition that if you carried a dead body across a regular field or private land, the spirit of the deceased would basically claim a right-of-way forever, haunting that land effectively permanently. Landowners were terrified of this ghostly easement. Conversely, if you walked on a corpse road while you were still alive and healthy, it was considered incredibly bad luck, as if you were inviting death to follow you home. So, your commute to work required dodging literal highways for ghosts just to avoid being cursed. 32. Walking down a narrow street under a castle or in a town was a high-stakes gambling game thanks to the phrase Garderobes. Before emptying a chamber pot full of night soil out of a second-story window, you were legally supposed to shout this phrase, which is a mangled version of the French garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. In reality, people often shouted it while they were pouring, or after the stuff was already mid-air. If you didn't look up fast enough, you would be drenched in a bucket of human waste. It was a world where you had to constantly scan the sky not for rain, but for falling excrement, making a simple walk to the market a dangerous game of poop roulette. 33. If you feel awkward when your doctor asks for a urine sample today, be grateful they don't treat it like a fine wine tasting session. In the Middle Ages, physicians were commonly known as piss prophets because they diagnosed almost every single illness by staring intensely at a glass flask of your urine held up to the light. They didn't even need to examine the patient physically, they just needed the jar. They used a complex color wheel to check the hue, but the real science, and the part that will make you gag, involved the taste test. Yes, your highly paid medical professional would take a literal sip of your warm bodily fluid, swishing it around their mouth to detect sweetness for diabetes or bitterness for other ailments. It was a medical system where the doctor was essentially a sommelier of human waste, confidently prescribing leeches based on the vintage and bouquet of your morning bathroom break. We just survived the filthiest tour in history. Now, here is the ultimate test for you. If you were forced to live in a medieval castle, would you rather be the Gong farmer swimming in waste pits, or the piss prophet who has to sip warm strangers' urine for a living? You have to pick one. Drop your choice in the comments. I want to see who breaks first. If this ruined your appetite, hit like and subscribe for more nightmare fuel.